I really did not expect to see this administration take such proactive Bitcoin role. And it's remarkable that they set up a strategic reserve. It's remarkable that they're talking about acquiring more Bitcoin. I think this is pretty shocking. You did not expect the US to be the first, because in my mind, you would always think that this would be something that others would flock to.
Welcome back to the Culture Bit. Dr. Saifedean Ammous, it's a pleasure to have you on the show again today. For those who don't know, Dr. Ammous is an economist and author of the best-selling book, The Bitcoin Standard, the very book that orange-pilled myself and probably 90% of the Bitcoiners that are very passionate about Bitcoin today. It's been translated into 39 languages. He's also written the Fiat Standard, Principles of Economics, and he's currently working on his new book, The Gold Standard. Last time we spoke was before Bitcoin Mina, leading up to that conference in 2024, where Dr. Ammous gave a keynote address on Austrian economics and his upcoming book. Today, we're going to catch up on everything that has been happening in the Bitcoin space and discuss all the fun stuff. The Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, global powerhouses adopting Bitcoin, and maybe some culture aspects too, some things tangential to Bitcoin that I know Saif has been talking about on his podcast. Saif, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Allen. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So great to have you here. Always an honor. Last time we chatted going into Bitcoin Mina, there was no Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. Price was soaring up to $100,000. We didn't have Trump coin or Libra token just yet. And so all eyes were on Bitcoin. And then post Mina, so much has happened. We now have a Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. It seems like we're beyond all of the, for lack of a better term, shitcoining that the current administration here in the US has been doing. What's your take on all this? What have been some of the most interesting developments in Bitcoin since the conference?
Well, as you said, yeah, it's a lot, and it's difficult to keep a track of it because just so much happens and so much is truly unexpected. I really did not expect to see this administration take such a proactive Bitcoin role. And it's remarkable that they set up a strategic reserve. It's remarkable that they're talking about acquiring more Bitcoin. I think this is pretty shocking. You did not expect the US to be the first, because in my mind, you would always think that this would be something that others would flock to because the dollar works fine. But I think there's two ways of looking at it, which is the Michael Saylor perspective, which is, look, let's just be smart about this. We have the dollar. As long as the dollar works, that's great. But if we're going to ever move off the dollar, if there's going to be another global reserve currency, it's going to be Bitcoin. So we might as well get in early on Bitcoin and secure our monetary primacy, which, won't be the same with Bitcoin because they won't be able to print Bitcoin, but they still have a lot of Bitcoin. So there is that perspective. There is that way of understanding it. However, I think realistically, looking at the administration itself, the president, his family, and the donors that have shaped it, I think it's more of a multi-coining and shitcoining experience where Bitcoin is included because it's the only one that doesn't sound extremely mentally handicapped when you try and explain it to adults, and everything else needs to come along with Bitcoin as a sort of side story. And it's much easier to market the shitcoins as side stories to Bitcoin rather than to try and do it independently. So I think there, we could talk about it, just how shocking it is that it's happened and how revolutionary it is. But perhaps we may need to, we can see that it's not perhaps that big of a deal, because I still don't think the administration is seriously convinced of Bitcoin, and they, not enough people, I think, in the administration itself are convinced enough to want to acquire it seriously in large quantities going into the future, or continue to hold it. So, if the price doubles, I think they might want to book some profits, perhaps. And I think the shitcoining itself makes me think that they just don't truly get it. So it might not be that big of a deal ultimately, because they still haven't bought any Bitcoin, and it's not clear that they will. So all that they've done is just announce that they're not going to be selling the Bitcoin that they acquired, which I think is a very smart thing to do. If you're the US government, you can print dollars, so it makes no sense to sell anything for dollars, particularly something that you can't print of that may replace the dollar someday. So it makes sense that if they come across Bitcoin, that they don't sell them. And that's, I think, a big boost for the price in the long term, because we've had a lot of, I think, some of the biggest crashes in Bitcoin historically, like the 1 day crashes, were brought about by government selling of Bitcoin. And so they've sold enormous quantities, and they keep finding more because they always, they're pretty handy, and they have a very loose definition of the concept of property. So it's highly likely that they keep chancing upon more Bitcoin. So if they keep hodling them, then that's going to mean a lot less of these giant auctions that they used to have that would bring the price down. So I still think it's significant, but it's not quite world changing yet. And I'm not so sure how much it'll stick. There's likely going to be other administrations. I'm not so sure that they're going to be as enthusiastic about it. And I'm not so sure it's going to be politically palatable to be buying, even in this administration.
Yeah, I think the biggest red flag right now, as it pertains to the administration's actions for the long-term health of the Bitcoin strategic reserve, is the fact that Trump had to use an executive order to begin at least pushing forward the legislative process in Congress. And hopefully Senator Lummis can do a lot in tandem with Howard Lutnick, Treasury Secretary Besant, and some others. But I think the biggest takeaway for me that I have, after some thought, has been the fact that this has just more than anything been a signal to the rest of the, Magnificent Seven, the BRICS nations, that the world economic power, as it currently stands, is looking to adopt Bitcoin. It's an interesting oxymoron, right? I know you talk a lot about the inflation aspects of the dollar, how the U.S. is in a debt spiral and needing to continue to print the money ad nauseum, just like all the other global superpowers before it. But it's interesting that they've embraced Bitcoin. That sent a signal to countries like Russia and China, even in the Emirates, right, where we were just at earlier in December, that they need to be looking at Bitcoin seriously as a way to protect not just their sovereign wealth, but the other powers that come with being a world government, so to say. And so maybe to take a couple steps back and go back to December, Bitcoin Mina, some of the other people that were there in attendance. I know Eric Trump gave a keynote on Bitcoin, which was honestly very, for a politician and a businessman, very well spoken, how he compared it to property, which I found very interesting. And then I know there were a number of princes there looking to learn more about Bitcoin, see how they can integrate it. And in recent news, they announced the buying of IBIT, the ETF, which still isn't Bitcoin, but still interesting. It's like, okay, we're getting somewhere there. I'm curious to hear from you, based on your interactions with others at the conference in Mina. What were some key takeaways from you? Did you feel like the Bitcoin conversation permeated enough in that region to the point where it's on equal footing of some of the action that's happening here in the States?
Yeah. First of all, I gotta say, just to go back to the previous question, one important thing is that I think they've embraced Tether a lot more than they've embraced Bitcoin. So there's a clear, coherent message that they're giving out about what they want to do with Tether, which is they want to keep letting Tether grow so that more and more people can use the dollars, and then Tether is going to have to be buying more and more treasuries. So that works well. It works well for Tether. It works well for the US government. And I think this is where they're really headed. But there isn't, and you can sell this as a political story. It's going to be very popular. It's going to be, it's, and it doesn't require as much of a political capital expenditure as trying to buy Bitcoin, because ultimately this is just about letting Tether continue to operate and do what it does. That's all that the administration needs to do, which other administrations might not have done. So it could have been that under Democrats they might have clamped down on this. But there seems to be a direction in that. And that people are saying, well, that's bad for Bitcoin. I don't think that's bad for Bitcoin, because I think Tether doesn't compete with Bitcoin. I think it competes with third world country currencies primarily. It competes with the currencies that have relatively high inflation rates, whose people can't really use their banking system. So it competes with these banks and central banks around the world that aren't functioning properly. And yes, that does add demand for the dollar, because these people will be using it. However, it's not that much demand for the dollar for two reasons. First of all, the dollar is already enormous, and these things are, these places where they have inflation are just not very prosperous because of all the inflation. So it's not that enormous in terms of wealth, even though it's a lot of people around the world. It's not that substantial in terms of wealth. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, that's wealth that's already buying treasuries on the back end. So people are ditching their local fiat currencies and their local fiat bank account. But the fiat currency and the bank account are stopped up by reserves at the central bank, and these central banks are buying treasuries as well and holding dollar cash. So you're replacing one US Federal Reserve surrogate, which is, say, the Central Bank of Turkey or Brazil, with another one, which is Tether. And it's not an equal replacement. So it's not that you're not adding any demand, because obviously the central bank and the local bank are likely a lot more levered on their tiny little bit of treasuries than Tether are, because Tether hold a very significant percentage of their worth in treasuries, and you would not get anything like that in your local fiat second layer bank account, or fourth layer or fifth layer by that point, if you're in a country with high inflation. So it's more demand for treasuries. But given that already the dollar is more than half of the world's money, likely, and it backs up so much of the world's money supply, that it's already gotten a significant amount of the world's money supply. So even in a very bullish case in which Tether 10x's over the next 10 years, let's say, that's a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, given how much US dollars are constantly getting printed, it's just all going down the drain. Anyway, it's not going to really ultimately change much, but what it will do is that it's going to onboard a lot of people into understanding the concept of private key, public key, and thinking of money in this cryptographic way. And that's a huge part of the mental hurdle that needs to be overcome in order to come to Bitcoin. So effectively, it's going to be advertising Bitcoin to the world, helping Bitcoin spread. And people who are going to be making the jump from the Turkish lira or whichever dysfunctional currency to the US dollar are going to be mentally prepared for making a similar jump from the US dollar to a far more superior alternative. So I think it's good for Bitcoin in that sense, and I don't think it's that much of a bonus for the US dollar as they are perhaps hoping for. And of course, it's also good for Bitcoin because Tether is a Bitcoin company and they keep buying more and more and more Bitcoin. There's one of the world's biggest buyers of Bitcoin currently. So they keep putting their money in Bitcoin. And I think the long-term implication of this is just absolutely fascinating, because what's going to happen over time is that their dollar stash is going to continue to devalue and their Bitcoin stash is going to continue to increase in value. And so at a certain point, I think they'll break the dollar peg, but they'll break it upward. One day they're just going to come up and say, one USDT is equal to 1.1 USD, and you can just get 10 extra cents, and then USDT becomes the new monetary standard because they can keep revaluing it over time as their Bitcoin appreciates and their dollar depreciates, and then eventually they can wean us. They can wean humanity off of the dollar, euthanize it, and then just give the world USDT backed with Bitcoin as just another layer on top of Bitcoin.
I've heard a lot of people say that Tether coming on to Bitcoin is the dollarization of Bitcoin. Do you think A, number one, that is a fair comparison, and B, is that a good or a bad thing?
Yeah, I don't agree with the terminology. I don't understand how that applies, and I've asked people to explain it to me, but I haven't really found it convincing. The notion that this is dollarizing Bitcoin, it's I don't see it in a practical sense, because what's actually happening is that Bitcoin and the dollar are competing currencies that trade against each other, and the dollar is not backed by Bitcoin. And so I don't understand what you could mean by dollarizing Bitcoin, because you can't dollarize Bitcoin because you can't do anything with Bitcoin. Bitcoin just is. You could Bitcoinize the dollar, in other words, back the dollar with Bitcoin. But that would mean making dollars redeemable for a certain quantity of Bitcoin. And I am sure the US government is nowhere near considering such a scenario, because at this point they have 200,000 Bitcoin, I think, which is around, what is it, $20 billion, I think? Or no, $200 billion.
Something like that around
I
there.
mean, it's hard to keep up with all of these numbers, but it's in the billions of dollars, and but the amount of dollars that they have outstanding is in the tens of trillions. So if they wanted to make it backed by this, they would have to make it at a price that brings the dollar down enormously compared to Bitcoin, so that they could redeem all of the outstanding dollars with Bitcoin. So that's not happening. But I'm just mentioning it as a concept to explain why I just don't see what people mean when they say they're dollarizing Bitcoin, because Bitcoin just continues to operate and trade freely on the market. People are free to pay whatever price or whatever good or service they want in exchange for it. So I think it's true that, as I was saying, the dollar can be supported by stable coins. That's true. But as I was saying, I don't view it as being that significant of a move to the dollar in terms of just how much demand it brings in, because the dollar supply is just going to be increasing likely at a very high rate anyway, that it's going to be eating up all of this extra demand. And it won't change anything about the fundamental dynamic, which is that the Bitcoin is going to continue to appreciate. So whether whether the government buys Bitcoin or not, I don't really see this as being a dollarization of Bitcoin. I don't see it as a threat to Bitcoin itself.
I would agree with that. I would agree with the sentiment that Tether and stables, to the points you made about public and private key adoption, is going to be a major catalyst for understanding of Bitcoin just on the technical side of things. If you're doing something repetitive every day and using, like Tether or whatever to, send money back to your family, you're going to get the same idea with Bitcoin. So if you're using Tether for the day to day, you'll be saving in Bitcoin. Seems like a no brainer. As it pertains to the dollar, and I know you mentioned treasuries, as of recently, treasuries have almost been weaponized against other countries who the U.S. deems, not allies, and specifically Russia. Recently, with the sanctions that they brought against them due to the Russian-Ukraine war. I've heard you talk about this a couple of times, but just for the audience, how does Bitcoin offer an alternative for countries or individuals looking to sidestep the US dollar? We've seen things like the rise of BRICS. Now, obviously, we have Bitcoin. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think if you followed economics news for a couple of decades now, there's always been a very long drumbeat of very loud drumbeat of people saying BRICS, China, India, Russia, these countries want to move away from the dollar. They're going to move away from the dollar. These countries are threatening to move away from the dollar. And there are always threats and stories and imminent doom and demise of the dollar. And I admit I used to find this very compelling and convincing at a certain point. But the more time went on, the more that I realized that these things are just sort of like shitcoin projects, and there's just a lot of promise and a lot less delivery. And so, thinking more about this, after I wrote the Bitcoin standard, I studied the fiat system more in detail and wrote the fiat standard about it. And thinking more and more of it, I realized that I think there is just a very strong network effect that drives people toward wanting to stay in the dollar. And so that ultimately is what locks countries in, so that even though their prime ministers or their governments or their foreign ministers or their nationalist press or whatever, even though they can be very vocal about we need to break away from the dollar, ultimately the people who manage the purses are, you don't get to manage tens of billions of dollars for a country if you don't, well, I mean, usually, if you don't have some idea about how to just manage money in large scale day to day. And in that sense, it sounds like such an evil conspiracy when you think about it, but I think there's a pretty benign economic explanation for it, which is these people need to put their money in places where they have liquidity. They have access to liquidity. They can move in and out at size. And so you need large liquid markets, and you need access to these markets, and you need to deal with banks that allow you to buy and sell on these markets in large quantities, because that ultimately makes a huge difference in the long term. So you need to be holding liquid assets, and you need to be holding the most liquid assets. So the most liquid asset is the US Treasury bond. And so there are a lot of conspiracies about how the US maintains its dollar role. But the more that I think about it critically, the more that I realize it's an economic advantage, in a sense, similar in some ways to the economic advantage that Bitcoin enjoys over shitcoins, which is because it has the network effect. In Bitcoin, it's more sophisticated because Bitcoin's decentralized, whereas the others are not. But there's also that dynamic where Bitcoin has the most liquidity. And so major money wants to be in Bitcoin so that it can go in and out. And that in turn brings more liquidity to Bitcoin. That's why we see more and more liquidity go into Bitcoin now than into the Ethereum ETFs, for instance. So it's a network effect that drives countries to want to have their money in treasuries, because the alternatives are not appealing. Even large stocks are not as easy to liquidate in large quantities, and large stocks are usually more volatile, although these days bonds are pretty volatile too, but at least they're not supposed to be, is what it says on the tin. And capital markets in countries other than the US are also very difficult. So there are capital controls in China. And so that makes it not a good place where you, as a non-Chinese person, would more like to park large amounts of capital, because it's not very easy to get it in and out. And so there's this old quote from Ronnie Coleman, the world champion, the Mr. Olympia bodybuilding champion. It's a really great quote, and it's very, very telling that it comes from somebody like him, because most of us imagine that, if you've made it into something like this, you're just built that way, and you want to wake up every day and keep working out until you become Mr. Olympia. But he says something really quite profound, which is everybody wants to be a bodybuilder, but nobody wants to lift no goddamn heavy weights. And I think it's a really, really very profound point, because even somebody like him doesn't want to lift weights. He'd rather be on his couch like you and me. But he still has to do it if he wants to be a bodybuilder. And it's similar to that with the global reserve currency. Everybody would like to replace the dollar. just like everybody would like to be a bodybuilder, but nobody wants to build a larger, more liquid market on a more free financial market with a less inflationary monetary policy. Nobody, that's a lot more difficult to pull off. And so it's easy to keep talking about we are going to replace the dollar, we're going to get rid of the dollar. You're not choosing a new color for your iPhone case. It's not a consumer choice. You're not going to boycott one brand of money and use another brand for money. If you don't have access to the dollar market, you have serious liquidity problems likely, and you are incurring large costs. And so the thing that drives this, in my opinion, is just the economic advantage. And that, for me, is why Bitcoin is such a big deal, because it's offering a compelling, it's doing the heavy lifting. It's not out there making press releases about dethroning the dollar, or at least some of us are in our books, but Bitcoin itself isn't. It's really out there doing the heavy lifting. It's doing the Ronnie Coleman thing. It's actually out there building a more liquid financial market that's more open than the dollar, and that's less inflationary than the dollar. So it's already got 2 out of 3 sorted. It's already less inflationary than the dollar, and it's already more open than the dollar. Anybody can access the Bitcoin. And then the third one, which we're working on very hard, is becoming more liquid than the dollar. So we're already at about $2 trillion. So I think that's really the tough part. Let's face it, going from 0 to 2 trillion is likely a lot harder than going from 2 trillion to. But depends where you want to really draw the finish line. I think you could say the finish line should be around 25, 30 trillion, which is the size of the US dollar treasury market, because that really is the big, most liquid market. So you could say that. I think at that point, this is where serious capital allocators have to consider Bitcoin from a fiduciary standpoint, just because it's a much more liquid market. Because treasuries are $25 trillion, but they're $25 trillion of many different maturities and many different kinds of bonds. So it's not really a fungible money. There are many tiny little different markets for each duration and each date of issuance. But with Bitcoin, it's just one Bitcoin is one Bitcoin. It's a massively liquid market. So you could say that would be the finish line. You could, or that would be not the finish line, but that would be the knockout punch. And then it's about, the referee blowing doing the counting and getting through the rituals. But that really is the point at which I think Bitcoin wins. If it's bigger than, you could say the treasury as a kind of lower end, or you could say the US dollar as a kind of higher end, which is at this point somewhere in the range of 80 to 100 trillion dollars. So, we need another 10, 15x to another 50x. So between 10 to 50x, depends on where you want to count as the punch. But after that point, it's all downhill from there. It's it's all plain sailing, I should say. It should, at that point, Bitcoin becomes the biggest market. So it's just going to be cannibalizing the rest of the world's monies and demonetizing everything, and just everybody would have some Bitcoin rather than have anything else to store value.
Where do you think a lot of that liquidity is going to come from? We're obviously in a totally different world now in 2025 than we were, in 2020, in 2017. I know we've talked a lot about governments, but banks here in the U.S. recently have been are now able to allow or are able to hold Bitcoin themselves. I think that's a very key indicator that liquidity is at a point that they feel safe enough to hold Bitcoin. The other thing that I think is very interesting is I had a recent conversation with Larry Lepard, and I know he just wrote his book, The Big Print. And one of the comments that he made to me is that the massive printing of the dollar that we saw during COVID is going to be a blip for the upcoming money printing over the course of the next 5 years, largely due to a large looming U.S. deficit that the debt has to be paid back. So where do you think things go? Do you think a lot of that liquidity comes from the dollar continuing to devalue itself, or is it a transfer of wealth from other hard assets and things like real estate?
All of the above. I think it's going to be everything. I think Bitcoin is still at this point, it's not significant enough for it to constitute any kind of noticeable drain on any one particular asset. It's so distributed and decentralized in so many ways that it's bottom feeding at this point. It's just eating leftovers from here and there, and it still manages to become the 10th biggest currency or 10th biggest asset in the world or something like that. So still one of the biggest assets in the world and one of the largest, most liquid markets in the world. But still not at a point where you could tie it to any other kind of major macro trend. So it's likely to continue to be boosted by all of those things. I think people all over the world are dumping their property and buying Bitcoin. I see this all the time. People tweet it all the time. People who just sell properties and buy Bitcoin because they realize it's a lot less hassle and a lot less work. So there's going to be real estate demand that's going to go toward Bitcoin. There will be treasuries demand. I think the last few years have been brutal for treasury bondholders, and I'm optimistic the next 5 will be even worse. So, I think some of them are waking up to this stupid cock fetish that they have for holding bonds and starting to allocate more and more toward non-cuck based financial instrument like Bitcoin. So, so yeah, I think it's going to be all of the rest. And yeah, it's difficult to argue with Larry because, as Lynn Alden also likes to say, there is no stopping this train. Nothing stops this train. And so there's a lot of noise being made about Doge and Department of Government Efficiency. And while I heartily encourage and recommend the rhetoric, I'm still disappointed with the output. And ultimately, it's proving to be a lot more of a political play to just target specific political enemies rather than actually make serious dents in government spending. Because ultimately, what it all comes down to is that 91% of the budget is spent on debt servicing, on entitlements, and on defense. And they're not coming near those three. They're not going to default. Well, who knows? With Trump, you can never say never, I guess. But realistically, it doesn't look like they're looking to default. On the contrary, they're looking to try and restore balance, trust in the treasury market, perhaps. Some people at least are saying that's the case. So, but at least they are working to bring that one down through trying to bring interest rates down. I think that they've said that they want to do that. So if they're going to try and bring interest rates down, then that would bring the interest expense. But still, it's still an enormous deficit, and they're likely to continue to run an enormous deficit and continue to add to the growing deficit. So that's not going, yeah, they could make some dents in that here and there by bringing interest rates down, but I'm not so sure how sustainable that will be. But then the other two, they're not even pretending to want to come near them. Nobody's going to come near the Pentagon, all the defense spending. There's just way too many fat pigs eating from that trough for anybody to want to come near it. And so you keep those two things running, then even if you manage to get the debt servicing somehow down by manipulating interest rates and not suffering massive inflation, then you're still, you're making a little bit of a change, but nothing too material. Ultimately, it doesn't really change the long-term trajectory. That die is cast. That train is off its rails, and it's headed straight to the cliff. So I'm not quite optimistic that there can be ways to be found out about it. I would say, if I were to make the optimistic case, I guess perhaps this is how I'm understanding, so I may be wrong, but this is how I see it. In the optimistic case would be we get as much of the spending down as possible, and we use that as a way to get inflation down. I think this is kind of the Keynesian thinking here, and there's some nugget of truth to it because government spending is inflationary. So we bring that down, and so then that requires less money creation, perhaps, and then less inflation, and therefore lower prices. And then all of the stock of tariffs supposedly is going to bring the stock market down. And the combination of dropping prices and dropping stocks is going to allow the Fed to lower interest rates, which would bring down the debt servicing. And so the idea here is you cut down the government spending and then you cut down the debt servicing, and then you buy yourself a time. Could be, but I think the last few years, I think since COVID, things have gotten a lot worse in terms of the fiscal situation at all levels of government, but also across the private economy, that I don't really see this as being sustainable, because you can't. I don't think you could really reverse course drastically enough to make enough of a change, but I could be wrong. Who knows? But either
Yeah.
way, the only actionable information out of all of this is just buy Bitcoin. Whatever happens, whether they pull it off, they don't pull it off, Bitcoin's going to continue to grow. Bitcoin's going to continue to grow regardless of any of that stuff. We've seen, this is the thing. People can make a lot more money, I think, trying to identify macro patterns with Bitcoin than just say the very humble but very infuriatingly simple thing, which I like to say, which is, look, Bitcoin's gone up and down with low interest rates, and it's gone up and down with high interest rates, and it's gone up in the long term, regardless of whatever is going on. So in the short term, anything can happen. In the long term, it's going to go up. And that's true, whatever is going to happen with macro. So whatever happens with macro, you don't need to pay attention. Just buy Bitcoin and live your life. Increase your income instead of trying to stress about what politicians are going to do.
Right. Stay humble, stack sats, up and to the right. Your wealth is melting. stored in Bitcoin, all the sayings.
Yes.
No, I appreciate the mantras are really powerful, especially in the culture sense, because not myself included, I'm no economic academic. My history of money comes on from reading books like the ones that you have published, and others within the space. And I think distilling it down for people to understand is like, hey, dollar bad, don't save in it. Bitcoin good because it's scarce. That's how you want to save. Increase your purchasing power so that generations down the line, there's something that you can do for your children, I think is a really important narrative. And that brings us to your book. So I want to talk about the gold standard, acutely named. And this one's an interesting book that you're writing because it's not a nonfiction. It's a fictional book. And as I understand, the reasoning behind it is to paint a picture for why, hard assets matter. So walk me through it. You've written 3 great books in the Bitcoin world, the Bitcoin Standard, the Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, kind of giving everybody the groundwork for our current economies, why Bitcoin's a solution, why Fiat's going to continue to print ad nauseum. And now we're here with a nonfiction. Why nonfiction?
Why fiction, you mean?
Or why fiction, sorry.
Yeah. Well, this is an idea that I'd had for a very, very long time of just a fictional book in an alternative universe for the 20th century. And it's something that I had long even before Bitcoin. And I had it in context that didn't even have to relate to money. But then as I started to learn about money and the history of the gold standard and World War I and how the world changed, it became just, it would constantly become more vivid. And I'd always wanted to sit down and write it. But I needed to write, the Bitcoin book, and then I needed to write the econ textbook, which I'd always had in mind. I'd always also had in mind, and the Fiat Standard, which was like the continuation of the Bitcoin Standard, or the second part of the Bitcoin Standard. But then when I finished those 3, I took a year break from writing. a whole year which I didn't write anything because I needed to get to know my family and get a life. And
Important things.
yeah, and, they were nice people. It went well for the whole year, but then my fingers were itching, so I had to get back at the keyboard. And then throughout that year, I was thinking and I was developing the idea of how it would happen, and I just and I just came up with a more elaborate story of how it could happen in a realistic way. And the key idea is, what would the 20th century have looked like if the world had stayed on the gold standard? And so this is a book written in an alternate timeline in the year 2000, describing the economic history of the 20th century on a gold standard, how the world functioned in the 20th century on a gold standard. And so how do we do it? And this is the part that took a lot of thought, which is, how do you put the gold standard into the 20th century? And I wanted it to be realistic in a sense. It could have just been, all right, 20th century. If you just impose it in a way, then you don't really get much value from the thought experiment, because that's the whole point of doing the book, is to think about it as a thought experiment. So it's an economic fiction book, really. I should say it's fiction, but it's also economics. It's going to read like the Bitcoin standard, but what the Bitcoin standard would have been like if it was written at the end of the 20th century on a gold standard. And so I thought long and hard about it, and I came to the conclusion that I couldn't just do some act of God that puts the world on a gold standard. It needed to really flow with the historical context and the way that things are going in a way that's realistic, so that you could actually have the real thought experiment where you're actually dealing with the world as it is. But something changes, and now, whoops, we no longer have government money and we have gold standard again. So how did I do that? I decided basically, and a good way to do it for me, I decided, was to keep the fiat standard for a whole year first, for a year and a half or so that the world gets a taste of it. So the best way to run a 20th century on a gold standard is to get the fiat catastrophe out of the way early. So instead of fiat being stuck for a century, we get a year of very intense fiat that then inculcates humanity for a century not to try this stupid bullshit ever again, by seeing just how horrible it is. And so I decided I was going to keep World War One. So a big part of the book is about how World War One starts. And the book carries through history up until September 1915. And then in 1915, something changes. So all of the world's history is practically the same until September 1915, except for one thing, and that's the catalyst that brings about the change in history, and that is the development of the aviation industry. So I've always been interested in reading about the history of aviation. I've always found it a very fascinating topic, and I wrote a paper about it a long time ago. But I've always found, the Wright brothers in that era, it's fascinating to me. It's something that still blows my mind. Every time I get into an airplane, I still can't believe airplanes work. There's a part of me that thinks, clearly this can't be real. You can't just be flying at 30,000. And the fact that people managed to pull it off at that period was always something that was very fascinating for me. So what I did in order to bring about this change was I decided that what would change is, one thing that held back aviation in the early years was the Wright brothers and the patents that they had. And so at that point, they were the first ones to manage to really invent flight. And there's a lot of bitterness about it, and there's a lot of controversy, and a lot of people say that they didn't actually invent flight. And there's bitterness that you can sort of justify it, because they went around basically suing every bird for flying after they did it, rather than working on their own thing. But there's no denying the contribution they made. They really figured out the mechanism which airplanes still use until today for flying. That's the technology that they figured it out. So what I do is that in around the year 1909, when they were at the peak of their litigiousness, going after the world, suing and flying to Europe to sue people in Europe, during that period, they get a change of heart and they decide that they don't want to spend any more time in courts and they're not going to sue people and they're just going to build airplanes instead. And what convinces them of that is, and then once they do that, then this French entrepreneur in France also um, decides that he wants to build. He's a real guy that exists. Who's basically the Satoshi Nakamoto of the 20th century in this story. He's a French. He's a French entrepreneur. He was the guy who invented the headlight, so made a fortune on headlights in the late 19th century in the real world. And then he was the first to fly across the channel from France to Britain. So famous for that. And he had a lot of money and he was crazy about aviation. He spent all of his time and money trying to build airplanes. And then he built one of the major French airplane makers, which later merged into Airbus. And so he made some of the most important innovations also in that period. So what I do is that I make him Satoshi Nakamoto in around the year 1910 or 1911 or something like that. And he decides that he wants to set up he wants aviation to scale. He wants aviation to grow. And he's looked at what Ford did for cars, and he decides to copy that for airplanes. But so he decides what we need is a commercial killer app for airplanes that would finance building more airplanes, that would allow us more capital to bring more production, to grow the industry, and then start producing cheap multiple airplanes that allow the industry to massively grow. But at that point, aviation was still expensive. So it was still expensive to run airplanes as a way for transportation. And it was still expensive to run it as a way for transporting goods because most goods were pretty heavy compared to their economic value. But there was one thing that's economic to put on airplanes in that economy of 1910 with the technology of 1910 airplanes. One thing that would be very valuable per weight. And what's the most valuable thing per weight? It's gold. And so he decides he's going to set up a gold clearance business in 1911 across Europe and the North America with the Wright brothers. And they set up this business. His name was Blériot. And so it's called the Blériot Transport Corporation, BTC for short. Nice. And so he sets up BTC in the in Europe and the US, and it allows businessmen and banks to clear gold with one another without having to go through central banks. And initially, it's just a couple of dozen airplanes here and there, and a couple of eccentric pilots flying around. And everybody thinks this is clearly a stupid waste of energy, and it burns so much electricity. And all the banks laugh at it, and the Financial Times and the New York Times say that it's stupid, and it's dismissed by all the experts, and everybody says this is clearly ridiculous, and there's no point for all this paranoia. Just use banks. But real businessmen, particularly the industrialists, they're the ones who save the day. They appreciate the efficiency. They appreciate being able to move money around. So people like Rockefeller use it because they've got businesses all over the US and the world, and they want to move capital around, and it's faster than just going with the bank. So you can have the retailers sending cash to headquarters and very quickly, much faster than trying to go through banks. So it becomes quite popular and continues to grow, and then World War I happens. And everything goes according to regular history, World War I, except in September 1915. That's the point when war was really getting ugly. That was when things had already gotten really bad in the Western Front in the first few months, but then things got really bad in the Eastern Front and in the Dardanelles in Turkey. So all of these fell into stalemate by 1915. That's when the war got really, really ugly. And that's where, in my alternative history, the airplanes lead to a bank run on all of the central banks. And so all the fiat currencies collapse. And so the war ends because the central banks can no longer print money to finance the war. And all of these gigantic empires who had all these dreams of grandeur, they need to now deal with the reality in which they no longer have a central bank and they can't just make money. And so now they're back on a much stricter gold standard. Gold moons effectively in that world because all of the gold paper backed, all the paper backed by gold, all the gold liabilities, all of that goes to zero because all the banks go to zero and all the central banks go to zero. And so physical gold becomes very valuable, and then reliable banks that use physical gold become extremely valuable, and they all run on BTC, a decentralized network with no central bank, but based on gold on airplanes. And so then that sets the stage for thinking about how the 20th century unfolds. The geopolitics, the economics, the technology, everything.
That's incredible. I love all the parallels you're drawing in there, especially the fact that you've been able to integrate a personality for Satoshi. Who is Satoshi, right? maybe you're clued into some alpha we don't know. And then the visualization of the network, the planes being kind of like the quote unquote payment rails of Bitcoin, but in this case, it's obviously it's gold.
Oh yeah, and the planes are called the company's called BTC, and the planes are called Lightning.
Oh, nice. I love that. No, I personally can't wait to read it. I know the first 4 chapters are currently out on your website.
Yeah, saifedean.com/TGS for the gold
pre-order
standard.
the book. It's set to come out in May, correct?
Yeah, although that was the plan, but I think it's going to probably be a little bit longer because I'm taking. I mean, it's the thing is with fiction. It's my first time doing fiction, and there's no right answer. With nonfiction, there's a clear question that you want to answer, and there's a clear thing that you want to cover, and then eventually you get to the point where you realize, all right, this is done. But with fiction, you can always add new things. You can always create new fake worlds and add events. And so I keep getting new ideas and I keep adding them. So I don't think I'm going to be able to make it in time for the Bitcoin conference in May. That was my plan. I was hoping to have it ready for the Bitcoin conference, but I'm at the point where I'm thinking, no, you know what? I'd just rather break my word and make a better book. So I'm sorry for the people that are waiting, but I'm going to sprinkle in a few more ingredients into this broth.
Well, it seems like you're really enjoying yourself writing this book. So I think everyone will accept your apology once they read it and they're like, "Thank you, Saifedean, putting in the extra time for this book." You mentioned the Bitcoin conference, and I know we're coming up on time here, so I want to be respectful of your time. You are going to be speaking in May. I know you just mentioned that the book's going to be pushed back. What are you going to be speaking on at the event that's upcoming? And what are some of the most interesting things that you think might transpire in the next 60 days?
To be honest, I haven't decided what I was going to be speaking about. I thought I would have the book ready and then I would talk about the book, but maybe that won't be the case because the book will likely not be ready. So I still need to make my mind up. Maybe it'll be an assessment of what the U.S. has gotten up to in the first 6 months of Bitcoining. Perhaps. I don't know. I'll think about it.
That would be an interesting topic for sure. There's it's up and down every day with the Trump administration. One week he's Bitcoiners' best friends. The next week he's launching another shitcoin token. So I'm excited to see for all the things that are going to transpire here in the next 60 days. Saif, I know we're coming up here on time. Where can people follow you? I know you already mentioned where people can buy the gold standard. But where can people listen to you? I know you have your podcast. You've obviously written a lot of other books. How can people get in touch with you and your works?
Yeah, my website is saifedean.com, saifedean.com. And there you can find my books and courses. My books are translated into many languages, so check out your favorite languages, and you can find how to get your copies of these. And I am also on the Bitcoin Standard podcast, one new episode every Tuesday on Bitcoin and all kinds of other interesting and controversial topics, where we don't really eschew, we don't really follow the fiat propaganda line, and we dissect it on everything. So join us for that. And then also, of course, I'm on Twitter at Saifedean always.
Awesome, Saif. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on today. Can't wait to see what you talk about at Bitcoin 2025, and can't wait to read the book. Appreciate you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you having me. Have a good day.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.